Thank you very much, Hoda, for the introduction. It is my honor to be here, and let me just greet you by saying Bonjour Anishinaabe, which means good morning or hello, all of my friends, all of my people. It's my honor to be here today. And I want to open, as we do in practice in Canada frequently, by acknowledging the traditional territory and the traditional owners and stewards of this territory. Now, because this is quite an old, white settled area, I had to do some deep Googling to try to figure out whose territory this is. So if I get it wrong, I ask forgiveness of the ancestors of the people that I wronged or I left out. But I want to acknowledge that we are meeting this day and these days on the traditional territory of the Piscataway and the Algonquin peoples, also known as Anacostia, hence the name of the river. And of course, the once great Powhatan Confederacy of this entire region. So I want to pay them my respects. I want to also thank, of course, University of Maryland's Baha'i Chair, Kate and Ernesto, for all of your wonderful assistance in getting us organized, and especially to Hoda for the invitation. It's really my distinct privilege to be here and share this research with you. As Hoda said, I am Anishinaabe from the Lake Superior Band of Ojibwe, and as I was speaking last night, we orient ourselves around the lake of what we call Gitchagumi, what the English call Lake Superior. So the border for us is a rather new construction. It's only 200 years old. We've been in that territory since the last ice age, so that's about 10 to 12,000 years. So as I was describing last night, when people ask me whether I'm American or Canadian, I say, I suppose yes to both, but I'm most importantly and significantly Anishinaabe. And so I want to speak to you today from the perspective of an Indigenous or Anishinaabe political scientist of international relations. And in my little bit of time this afternoon, I want to speak about how I view Indigenous peoples' rights as something that is potentially paving a revolutionary, or what we could think of as perhaps an evolutionary, long-term path toward what could be a new future in law, in governance, and in our societal structures. But it's a future that ultimately requires a significant amount of effort from all of us to think outside the existing structural boxes. So as we often discuss in critical international relations circles, both the practice and the discipline of international relations, like many other conservative disciplines, has a particular set of enshrined fundamental assumptions that are highly problematic for Indigenous peoples. Presumptions about the state, liberalism, the nature of human rights, each and every one of which mask certain sets of problematic power relations and either overlook, silence, or completely erase Indigenous peoples, our political orders, and our alternative ways of living and being in the world, and of how we view the international and its significance. However, there's been what I think is a significant opening. I'm sorry I keep playing with this, but it seems taller than I am. But this new opening, a new energy, is pushing for inclusion of Indigenous peoples and worldviews and respect for Indigenous peoples' rights. And while this is a hopeful turn towards a more humane future and a more just global future, I also need to pause and discuss why it's ultimately so very challenging to do so. But again, if we take this new path seriously, how we can all be transformed by it over time. So while Indigenous peoples are predominantly dismissed as marginal non-state actors in the international system, and Indigenous rights are typically cast off as aspirational, non-binding human rights, I argue in my book that they are actually quite the contrary. And the title of my book is Global Indigenous Politics, A Subtle Revolution. And I just have to pause as a sidebar and say, When I researched and wrote this book between 2007 and 2015, I think the subtitle was very fitting. It was indeed subtle. It was never discussed in public or in the media, occasionally in the UN, but that was about it. In Canada, certainly, from 2015 forward, we can say it's no longer so subtle, but I think subtle still applies to the rest of the world. But I argue that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is more than just a new set of norms and a new set of rights emerging and diffusing on the global stage, but it is actually rather a potential moment of revolutionary transformation. But it is sorely overlooked and definitely underappreciated. And I just want to mention this book represented about a decade of on-the-ground qualitative research. So it was both a series of interviews, more than 30 interviews with Indigenous activists and advocates from around the world, but also my own observation of and participation in transnational Indigenous political activity. Now, my official research started in 2007. I always say my real research started at the age of 5. Because I grew up in activist circles in Minneapolis. And so from the 70s forward, all of those activities segued right into the international movement. So I actually started this research many, many, many years ago. Now, the body of Indigenous political and legal theory that has emerged and blossomed since the late 1990s, really, speaks directly to all of the colonial assumptions of international politics. And even though they don't situate themselves necessarily in IR, many of them speak to different facets of IR. And they intervene in openings provided by post-colonial scholars, feminist scholars of recent decades. And by examining international politics through this lens of Indigenous political theory, we reveal quite a problematic state of what we can call incomplete post-coloniality, which is also referred to as a state of settler colonialism that has never ended. It results from the institutional, the structural exclusion erasure of Indigenous peoples in all existing systems of governance. And Indigenous political and legal theory calls for this completion both through Indigenous inclusion and accommodation of difference. And the global post-colonial completion challenge then is that inclusion and accommodation of difference are not so easy and not so easily wedded together. And ultimately they force a complete rethinking of not so small things as the state, decolonization, liberalism, how we do diplomacy, and the biggie, Westphalian sovereignty. So in this keynote, I want to put forward 2 arguments related to Indigenous rights. The first, and I've already gestured to this, is that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the UN DRIP as it is quite unaffectionately known, was a significant global achievement because it represents, as I argue, an often overlooked and underappreciated transformational moment. From its earliest beginnings in the 1970s, the Indigenous Rights movement at the United Nations, by simply seeking the international recognition of Indigenous rights, by definition sought a set of fundamental changes to the United Nations, the human rights system, and the wider international system. And again, some of these changes are small and incremental, and some of them are actually much more revolutionary. Because the Indigenous rights regime, as articulated in the UN Declaration, does not add any new rights for Indigenous peoples to the human rights consensus, but rather it challenges all of the fundamentals of the human rights system and the Westphalian system of sovereign states. The second argument then follows from the first. Because of the transformative nature of Indigenous rights, the real potential of the UN Declaration lies in how it is implemented. So in other words, I like to say, its potential lies in its potential. And the real potential for that document involves significant global change. It's change that cannot simply be compartmentalized for Indigenous peoples within existing systems. It requires much deeper systemic changes. So I posit that the UN Declaration and the body of Indigenous rights that it contains represent 4 sets of international change, not only for Indigenous peoples, but also to the conduct of a wider global politics. First of all, and this is, I think, incredibly significant and unnoticed by most of the field of international relations, the adoption of the UN Declaration by the General Assembly and then the follow-up of the endorsement or the support of the 4 countries who voted no represented the first time in post-war history that a broad set of collective rights was accepted by consensus within the human rights regime. So again, from its earliest beginnings back in the 1970s, the Indigenous Rights Movement has asserted that an exclusively individual rights framing of human rights was and is insufficient to accommodate Indigenous rights and has actually been performing a certain set of violences. Indigenous peoples, as peoples, also need protections as those collectives, especially in the area of cultural rights, land rights, and of course, self-determination. Now, the UK and the US, along with a couple other nations like Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, have all expressed longstanding concerns about the incompatibility between collective rights and individual human rights, arguing that any recognition of a broad base of collective rights leaves individuals vulnerable within groups. Now, Indigenous activists widely reported, and I must have heard this several dozen times, that throughout the entire Cold War period, the US always opposed any international instrument that included collective rights out of fear that they represented some part of the communist agenda that was taking over the world. So when the UN Declaration, as a broad statement in support of collective rights, passed the General Assembly by an overwhelming majority of 143 yes votes, and then voted on by the UK, and then later endorsed by the USA, was clearly an important transitional shift in post-Cold War world politics. And the US endorsement of the UN Declaration in 2010 even included a specific statement in support of the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, the very first time in US history that that has ever happened. So again, one fundamental shift in a long-standing US position opposing collective rights. Secondly, the UN Declaration, at least morally and politically, and we're working on legally, corrects the discriminatory legal exclusions of Indigenous peoples from the global decolonization project. Now, this requires some explanation. Going back again to the 70s and moving forward, the Indigenous Rights Movement, made up of advocates and activists, sought to correct 2 important, highly discriminatory legal doctrines that have served as the legal foundation of settler states. First, the Doctrine of Discovery, and then the saltwater or blue water thesis, both of which are exclusions of decolonization. Now, the Doctrine of Discovery originates from the papal bulls from the Age of Exploration, and it justified European discovery, claim, and exertion of sovereignty over all non-European lands and peoples. Now, the saltwater thesis. For those of you who may or may not be familiar with the UN decolonization project, I'll elaborate. In 1960, the UN officially delegitimized colonial rule with its declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. And while this 1960 declaration proclaimed that all peoples have the right of self-determination, it neglected to define peoples or offer any guidance on how to determine who was actually eligible for decolonization. So conflict arose immediately between proponents of what came to be called the Belgian thesis, and this group argued that all peoples, including those colonized within states, were entitled to the right of self-determination, while the proponents of the alternative, called the saltwater or blue water thesis, argued that only non-contiguous colonial territories, those located over salt water, were eligible for decolonization. The saltwater argument found support among a very strange coalition of both the settler colonial states of the Western Hemisphere, joined by their friends Australia and New Zealand, and the communist bloc. And that was a group that did not align so well in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but they did on this issue, and they considered the Belgian thesis a direct attack on both the multi-ethnic Soviet Union and the settler states of the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So for these two groups agreed on something, and that was that the saltwater thesis prevailed in the decolonization project, thus defining peoples eligible for decolonization and self-determination exclusively as those living in overseas colonies, and thus by law and by practice excluded indigenous peoples from decolonization and gave them a reduced right of self-determination vis-a-vis all other peoples. So the UN Declaration in 2007 and the Indigenous Rights discourse surrounding it delegitimized both of these principles in international law and at least technically correct these exclusions. Although the ongoing question of how this is to be accomplished remains an item of ongoing negotiation, both on the global level and at least within most individual domestic contexts. Thirdly, the international Indigenous Rights movement sought and achieved through the UN Declaration to create and provide a guiding framework for Indigenous state relationships based on a new understanding of self-determination. Article 3 of the UN Declaration states that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination equal to all other peoples. But at the same time, the UN Declaration also offers protections for existing state sovereignty and territorial integrity in Article 46. As a side note, Article 46 is one that Indigenous activists had absolutely no role in drafting or including in the text, and they did not consent to it, although in the end they ended up not opposing it either. And with the decolonization project of overseas colonies largely, if not entirely completed, the open global question in front of us is, what does self-determination mean now moving forward? Is it something other than existence as a sovereign, independent, territorial nation state? And if so, what does that mean? According to the text of the UN Declaration, Indigenous peoples' self-determination means that they have, quote, the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. It is said to include multiple possibilities, including self-government, autonomy, and various types of political engagement with states. Virtually each and every one of the Indigenous activists I interviewed over the course of the decade that I was doing the formal research all expressed a desire for independent or autonomous structures, but only a few expressed the desire for statehood per se. As one individual said, the state is inherently a European colonial structure, and so we do not base our claims on it. What we seek is our nationhood as peoples. We seek freedom and the space to live and govern ourselves as we see fit. That's what I think is self-determination. Statehood can provide it, yes, but so can many other ways of thinking and doing things. Now, the UN Declaration does not provide any sort of universal prescriptive solution for what self-determination should mean in practice. In fact, I like to say it's the antithesis of a universal prescriptive solution. Rather, it compels a space of negotiation for a multitude of political arrangements, again, with options ranging from full autonomy to self-government to enhanced participation with the state. Although presumably, we could offer future imaginings and innovations of what shared sovereignty could look like. So the wider implication that follows from all of this is that self-determination from this moment forward can mean something far different from independent territorial sovereign statehood. And the meaning of self-determination and decolonization are constantly evolving, both on the global level, and Indigenous rights, I think, have a very important role to play in this global conversation. And in fact, I often think they're leading this global conversation. Now, there's a fourth change that I've identified, and this required me to step out a bit of what I know and observe people I knew, but from an outsider's perspective. And that is that the activists and advocates that worked together in the Indigenous Rights Movement over the course of 3 decades, that's 30 years, 30 years of holding a movement together from the 1970s till 2007, and it continues, have demonstrated that global politics can operate in indigenous ways, or what I call transnational indigenous ways of being. And I've seen that this movement is quite a unique force in global politics because it's reshaping and modeling some incredibly alternative forms of politics, both at the United Nations and in many other international fora. And when I say it's grounded in transnational indigenous ways of being, I mean it has grassroots activist origins. It's deeply anti-colonial, both in nature and in practice. And it consistently and in multiple ways challenges just about every international structure of domination and subordination that it comes up against. At the same time, indigenous political actors are incredibly intelligent, strategic, creative, and articulate diplomats on the global stage, acting as diplomats, and seeking a global space of dignity for indigenous peoples. And global indigenous politics, thus, is bringing forward ways of practicing global politics that differ fundamentally from the predominant state-centric power politics practices that we're used to seeing. And by drawing on indigenous ontologies, values, commitments, global indigenous actors offer a new, or I think rather an old, method of practicing international politics. And while indigenous cultures vary tremendously around the world, there is a broad tendency toward a shared vision of life and the universe as interconnected, and therefore a pattern of very respectful relationships are cultivated and maintained in this vision, and this is what characterizes the movement. So even with a long history of incredible oppression and creative tactics by states, this group has presented itself in this way on the international level, and this norm of respectful relations is always maintained. Now, I want to just bring forward some examples, some elements of this approach to the global indigenous movement and how they have done this work over these decades, all of which emanate from their original basis in community and grassroots, and reflecting these frameworks, and I should mention, often female-led movements, despite this picture. So first of all is consensus decision-making, and the photo I have up there is from the very first International Indian Treaty Conference in 1977, and that was still a point where men were out in front of the cameras. So this form of practice, the search for unifying indigenous positions through consensus, first appeared at those conferences in the 1970s. And in the Indigenous caucus meetings that I've observed over time, consensus is always the primary objective and the focus of process. It is always the first choice of any sort of decision making, and it takes an extraordinarily long time to build consensus. And there are cases, and the Indigenous Caucus is constrained by time and resources as much as any other political decision-making body, and occasionally a vote is required in order to reach a final decision, although in the Indigenous Caucus, this is viewed as very suboptimal and absolutely a last resort. Secondly, broad and open participation. And this is how I can say this project began when I was 5, because this has been the ethos. It includes elders, youth, children, community leaders, women, all in balance. And broad and open participation by Indigenous groups has always been a core objective of this movement. And strong attention is always paid as well to geographic balance when working on the global level. So all regions are represented and leadership is traded off and rotated. And achieving this mix of community-based people, different tribal governments, and political organizations has always been a goal. Elders and youth and children have been included and play a central role in meetings. And women's leadership has always been central. And gender balance is just normally present with both men's and women's voices equally represented, often without deliberate attention. It just happens. And here's one that shook up the UN. Spiritual and community groundedness. And Indigenous representatives began this struggle right away in the first meeting in 1977 in Geneva. And they inserted Indigenous culture and spirituality boldly and unapologetically into all of their conference proceedings. And they began it the day before the very first conference when they opened in Geneva, and the Haudenosaunee chiefs entered Geneva in their regalia and presented the mayor of Geneva with an invitation wampum in an opening ceremony. And the mayor talked about this for years because he didn't know what to do and how to deal with this. Now, multiple Indigenous participants from that earliest Geneva conference that spoke with me all testified to the importance of that cultural and spiritual grounding in achieving the solidarity among the movement. So at both the first 77 and 81 conferences, the Indigenous participants insisted on opening and closing each and every meeting, each and every day, with an Indigenous prayer or cultural ceremony on a rotating basis, again, to get that geographical and gender balance. This was in direct opposition to all UN standing rules. They did it anyway. And it's a tradition that the UN has come to accept in Indigenous circles over a period of time. Now this gets to the activist grassroots level. The movement has always been willing to engage in collective action tactics as a part of their diplomacy model. Again, that international movement internationalized from its grassroots origins in local and domestic movements, but it's always tried to stay grounded and connected to this community base of support. So at the 1974 North American International Indian Treaty Conference, the elders and the traditional leaders and the American Indian Movement activists made a decision to deliberately shift from an entire focus on direct activism into this international diplomacy model of the International Indian Treaty Council as what's sometimes called the international arm of the American Indian Movement. And on the Canadian side of the border, the leadership of George Manuel was also deeply rooted in local activism. And a result of all of these origins, the Global Indigenous Caucus is made up of many of those original activists and new generations of activists, which translates into what I would call strong personalities and individuals who are deeply committed to their cause. So the movement, if forced, won't hesitate to utilize collective action techniques to challenge the UN system to provide them with fair and just access and accommodations. It's not the first choice. Diplomacy is the first choice. But if pushed, collective action is the last resort. And in the last 3 decades, the Indigenous Caucus, or portions of it, have engaged in protests, walkouts, and even a hunger strike at certain critical junctures in order to draw attention to whatever structures or practices were creating a blockage or an unjust situation. Now, in terms of the theory, this is a graphic taken straight out of the 2016 book, which visually shows Indigenous rights as global change, but also shows us where the greatest and largest challenges are. So prior to the passage of the UN Declaration in 2007, international human rights law and discourse excluded the 2 elements that are crucial to Indigenous peoples. So as discussed earlier, the international human rights regime did not generally include collective rights to maintain such things as culture, language, religion, identity, or their own educational systems in the face of assimilated pressures from the state. And these rights, which I call soft rights, are indicated in the chart by the box with the rounded corners. And then secondly, Indigenous peoples' self-determination and their collective right to maintain lands were also specifically excluded from the post-World War II UN decolonization regime, as I mentioned, by the Doctrine of Discovery and the Saltwater Thesis. These are the hard rights that states, and especially settler colonial states, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, resist most fiercely. You'll see I have a explosion graphic around that one. They are explosive in many, many ways. So in the decolonization era, self-determination was presumed to mean independent statehood. And the Indigenous Rights Movement, of course, aimed to secure self-determination and land rights for Indigenous nations with or without statehood. And it was a shift that ultimately requires us to think and reconsider those rights in the explosion. And I delineate them into hard and soft categories in order to draw out state responses to them. Hard rights strike at some of the most important fundamentals of the existing international system: land, territory, sovereignty, self-determination. And because Indigenous groups were presenting and pushing for re-articulations of these concepts, I term them hard rights in order to indicate both the difficulty of negotiation, but also to expose the perceived threat they pose to the hard core of the international system. Soft rights like language, culture, education, religion are collective rights extensions of existing human rights. So while recognition and protection of soft rights involves some change to thinking about inclusion of Indigenous peoples and the complementarity of collective rights with individual rights, the changes required to secure these are not as unsettling, as fundamental as the changes brought forward by the hard rights. And thus, the majority of states in the world have accepted them or accommodated them much more readily. But the 30-year battle with states over Indigenous rights particularly stemmed from the explosion graphic of land and self-determination. So while this movement demanded a shift to include collective rights, it was this quest that proved the most threatening to states and the international system. Now, and where we are in Canada at the moment, the discussion of the potential for real global change here lies not in the document itself, but in the implementation of it. And the implementation, as articulated by the UN Declaration, necessitates a reordering, a rethinking of sovereignty, and expects states to implement a whole set of legal, constitutional, legislative, and policy changes that will accommodate difficult questions like land rights, and what now is that hot issue in Canada, free, prior, and informed consent, redress, and then again, the variety of plural sovereignty arrangements on the table. Indigenous rights could represent a very early and incredibly nascent articulation of an entirely new international order, a new way of living and being. Instead of hierarchical orders that include domination and extraction and exploitation, colonial control, essentially, indigenous rights have been, for the most part, articulated by indigenous political actors themselves, and they could be on the cutting edge of a radically new order based on indigenous style principles, viewpoints, ontologies, things like mutual respect, sustainability, reciprocal relationships, and the ongoing negotiation of political questions. In the discipline of IR, putting my academics hat back on, and especially in the area of human rights study, we look at international norms. So we study not only what norms currently exist among and between nations, but we study how they came to exist, and we examine how they emerge, diffuse, evolve, become socialized, and also how various political actors react to them. So this is another graphic taken from my book, and it relates to indigenous rights and international norms. Now, the norms literature in international relations has not yet considered the possibility of fundamental transformative norm shift away from what I call state-centric norm space, the current system, into something entirely new. This type of shift would represent a new form and a means of global politics and political organization, essentially the post-colonial completion project of the remnant structures of colonialism and the practices in the current international system. And I observe that the nature of global indigenous rights and politics is dual. It operates on the one hand to seek equality within the existing order, or what I refer to as norm plane A. But on the other hand, it's serving as a transformational norm vector, helping us to move from one norm space to an entirely new space. But it's the second category of more difficult and problematic rights norms and the new ways of doing global politics that present challenges to the existing international order that are so fundamental that we begin to break through norm space A and move towards norm space B. But before I get too carried away and too celebratory, I have to recognize that states, and especially the wealthy and powerful states, again, the four settler colonial states, are obviously highly invested in the current order. And so while there was near global consensus in original votes for and then later endorsements for the UN Declaration, at least on a rhetorical level, states can be expected, I think, in their actual behavior to be highly recalcitrant in their acceptance of the full body of indigenous rights because it requires them to alter their old ways of doing things. And as a number of my book chapters seek to demonstrate, there are what I see as some strange and convoluted patterns of state behavior in relationship to indigenous rights, especially amongst the English-speaking settler states. Strange and convoluted in accordance with the international relations, human rights, and compliance literatures, and I just want to highlight a couple examples quickly from the book. The first pattern is what I call selective endorsement. This means that after originally voting against the UN Declaration in 2007, and there were 4 countries that voted against: Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. Each of these 4, within a couple years, shifted their official position on the declaration to support or endorse during the years 2009 and 2010. Now, each one of these 4 countries, in their support of endorsement, included qualifiers and exclusions and footnotes about how it was going to be implemented in domestic law. So far from a full endorsement of Indigenous rights, these 4 countries actually engaged in something much more nuanced. And I argue that by selectively endorsing Indigenous rights, these 4 countries seem to be expressing their rhetorical support for Indigenous rights, while also strategically, collectively, and most problematically, as a bloc, unilaterally writing down a global consensus on Indigenous rights and constraining them so that, by a magic wand, their current laws, policies, and practices automatically align with their interpretation of Indigenous rights. The second pattern is a related concept that I call over-compliance, and I always put that in quotes. Had to argue with my publisher that I should have that in quotes completely. And in this chapter of the book, I look at particular global patterns of state compliance or non-compliance with Indigenous rights. Now, state compliance with any international law regime is normally in the literature only considered as compliant or non-compliant. And my analysis actually shows 5 possible outcomes: compliance, non-compliance, under-compliance, partial compliance, and then this new concept that I'm calling over-compliance. Now, I'm going to walk quickly, in the interest of time, through the next few slides to explain what I mean by this. But in the bottom line, it means their conduct is actually greater than their commitment. Not because their conduct is so great, but they keep their commitments so very low. So just quickly, again, in the interest of time, I created a data set of 58 countries with significant indigenous populations, meaning greater than 1%. And then I related each country's commitments to its behavior, and then I have different forms of assessing those. And you can always look in the book for more detail on this. And then I had a formula for coding, comparing their commitment and their behavior in order to get at the outcome of their compliance. The results are, of those 58 countries, 17% are completely non-compliant, meaning they have low commitment and low behavior. 52% under-compliant, 21% partially compliant, meaning there's some gap between their commitment and their behavior. 3% are compliant. That was, at the time, 2 countries in the world. And then 7%, or these 4 countries, are over-compliant. Just a quick look at the different countries. There is no geographic pattern here. I've done every single type of analysis, and they are entirely random. Other than our 4 friends, the over-compliant countries. And again, an over-compliant country is one that paradoxically takes certain constitutional, legal, or policy actions to recognize categories of rights or indigenous rights that go beyond their own obligations or their normative commitments. And it's important to remember that I put over-compliance in quotes because it doesn't imply that these states are complying with or exceeding any sort of international standard. They most certainly are not, but it indicates again that these states are performing well above the level that would be expected based on their extremely low rewriting of the commitment. So it's a very clever and nuanced behavior, and it seems to, coupled with selective endorsement, keep these expectations low enough so that the status quo can be interpreted as being in line with indigenous rights standards. So the challenge before us, all states fear indigenous rights, but some, like settler states, feel that they must contain and control and limit the rights of indigenous peoples, or some sort of violence and chaos will erupt. States act as though Indigenous people and Indigenous rights are some sort of direct threat to their existence, and so they need to oppose them. But I argue it absolutely doesn't need to be this way, that actually recognizing and accommodating for Indigenous rights is a pathway to peace and justice and better understanding in society. It's not the states that are at issue, it's not the societies that are at issue, it's the old colonial doctrines and practices and discourses and the ways of doing business that have to be eradicated and redesigned. So the implementation challenges before each and every one of us is how to imagine, how to create, how to rethink, how to renegotiate all of the institutions and forms of political relations. But I honestly think that if we do so, what awaits us at the end of that path is a whole new and ultimately more just future. And with that, I want to say Chimigwich, which is thank you in the Anishinaabe language. It's been an honor to be here, and I want to thank you for your attention, especially at the end of day 2. So it's been a pleasure.
Okay, so we have time to take a few questions. If you would please again come. Yes, we have takers. Great. Please.
Thank you, Professor Lightfoot, for that presentation. I wondered about indigenous people, the nature of cooperation among the indigenous, the global indigenous movement with people outside of the Big Four, the Anglo-settler countries, particularly in the rest of the Americas. And I'm also thinking of places like Southern Africa, Khoisan, and people in northern Scandinavia, what's left of what we used to call the Lapps, and so on, and other indigenous communities in Central Asia and so on. I wondered to what extent they are included in this movement and how the conditions of struggle are different for them beyond the Anglo space. Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and in my work I go into that in quite a bit more depth, but for the interest of coverage, I oversimplified. The movement did come from what we would call the global north. It began in those North American grassroots activist origins. However, even in 1977, which was the first international conference in Geneva, the Latin American peoples were there. It hadn't grown much beyond the Western Hemisphere at that point, but by 1981, which was the second major international conference hosted by a UN organization, the Sami were there, the Australian Aboriginal peoples were there, the Maori were there, a sprinkling of peoples from Africa and Asia who didn't really use the word indigenous yet at the time were there in 1981, because the question in 1981 was about land rights. And so that brought in a number of groups. As it moved into the UN working group following the 81 meeting, all of these groups joined together under what was becoming to be called the Indigenous Movement. That's not to say that there haven't been disagreements or points of dissensus, but one of the strengths of this movement throughout those 3 decades was that those points of disagreement were handled within the movement, so that when they came to negotiate with states or came to the UN floor, it was a unified movement. Again, not 100%. It wasn't unanimous ever, and some of the disagreements over issues and identity got quite heated at times, and questions of who should be called indigenous were always on the table, but the movement held strong to the idea that if anyone self-identifies as indigenous, they're welcome here. And they were able to achieve that and kept definition out of the final document. And that was part of the 30-year battle. The states were always trying to constrain what was indigenous, and the movement was trying to keep it very broad and open. Language difference was always handled very delicately and with a lot of deliberateness. Getting interpreters in the early days was expensive, but it was something that was a priority, so that even at caucus meetings, there would be Spanish-English interpreters. The chair of the caucus is usually co-chaired, a Spanish speaker and an English speaker, so that there's always a balance. It's very deliberate in terms of unity and solidarity. I think a particular strength of this movement.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Sheryl. I learned a lot about this. You know, I'm really interested in movement building. And I mean, partly in response to your response right now, I'm wondering exactly how the disparate indigenous groups managed to build a movement from different countries. And I'm thinking about, of course, you know, 2007 was the UN Declaration, and as Keck and Sikink, Jackie Smith, and even my own work on Transnational Feminist Network shows, that period of the 80s, but in particular the 90s, were a period when there was a great deal of this transnational advocacy occurring. So I'm sure there were some building blocks before, but I guess the question is, how were the indigenous groups from around the world able to come together and build a movement that then you know, resulted in the 2007 declaration? And then my second question has to do with, you know, the Belgian thesis and the saltwater or blue water thesis. I guess I was a little taken aback because, you know, the Soviet Constitution actually includes the right to self-determination. You know, that was one of their, that was the only country that actually had that. So I was just wondering whether, in fact, I was doing a little bit of research while you were talking about that, and it seemed to me that the Belgians, the French, and the English were opposed to the so-called Belgian thesis. I'm sorry, they promoted the Belgian thesis because this was a little bit of politicking. These were three countries that had lost their territories, they'd lost their colonies, they were upset about it, and they wanted to be a little disruptive, it seems to me. Would you agree with that? Anyway, I'm just throwing it out there. Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to start with the second one because that's actually, I'm chuckling because it was actually a bit cheeky. And the Belgians, and you know, this was the post-war era, and the Belgians and the British and the French had held these vast colonies, and then through the course of the 20th century then required to give them up. And they thought fair is fair, and that should apply to everyone else, and particularly the United States they were looking at the time. So it was actually a bit of a stick-in-the-eye movement. And unfortunately, the indigenous peoples of the world paid the price for that because they ended up on the losing end of that conversation. And yes, the Soviet Union initially and the communist movement initially, and if we go way back to the Bolshevik revolution in the very early days, self-determination was what they were about. But I think as the Soviet system took hold and their empire expanded, they reverted back to a more colonial form of thinking. And so their worry was that different ethnic groups were going to start identifying as indigenous and claim more independence or breakup of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact at that time. So yeah, there were actually a lot of funny stories about that that I could share if we had more time. Now, how they were able to create the movement is a couple things. Again, initially it was a global North movement. So in terms of communications and ability to travel and the resources to build NGOs were coming from the North American context. And so this has always been one of the tensions in the movement, is how those organizations who are so rich in so many ways can facilitate a movement of everyone and how to balance and use those resources to their best maximum potential without dominating others. And that's been a constant challenge, and I think that's where the different practices come into play as well. And so I think through the 90s, where we had the expansion of cell phone communications, zines, blogs, the internet came onto play. In the developing world, when they just leapfrogged over landlines and moved into cell phones and internet technologies, that's when the Global South piece really came into play. And now it's completely social media and internet enabled. So I'm in daily conversations with Indigenous groups all over the world, and the first thing I do every morning is check, since I'm one of the last ones to get up every day on the west coast of North America, and the whole day has happened by the time I even wake up, the first thing I do is check the news in New Zealand and Australia and Asia and Africa and Sami and see what's going on and see who's posting what news. So it's a daily event now, real time, and so that enables quite a bit of solidarity. And fundamentally, a lot of the issues are the same. Even though the legal structures are different and the political structures are different around the world, the pattern of dispossession, whether it was the British colonizing or whether it's a post-colonial regime that's maintaining those conditions and those impulses of domination and subordination, the experiences on the ground of indigenous communities, whether it's Bolivia or Botswana or Northwest Territories, is strikingly the same. And so I think those experiences bring people together.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Peter Lowe, and I have a specific question about a specific situation. I'd like to see your response to it. I'll give you a little bit of the background of how it got into this. I grew up in western South Dakota in a town that was 20-25% Lakota. And the old people would talk a lot about the Treaty of 1864 in Laramie, Wyoming. They always called it the Laramie Treaty, in which the Lakota were allowed to keep large sections of the Dakota Territory, and most importantly, a very important sacred area called the Black Hills on the western side of the parcel that they were being allowed to keep. Now, I'm not Lakota, so I'm not speaking for Lakota. Please understand, I'm an outsider talking about a situation that I used to hear about. I think this probably has something to do with the UN business of the hard rights and land use. And I also wondered if it didn't have something to do with the legal correcting discrimination against legal exclusions. I wonder if this is a legal exclusion. The Lakota people, sometime in the 1960s, mounted a suit for the stealing of all of the land that was awarded to them in the treaty, in the Laramie Treaty of 1864. They won the suit. But the cruncher that came out of this was how they were going to collect. The Supreme Court said, yes, you were cheated out of your land. Restitution must be given to you. So, but they didn't tell you what kind of restitution. So the United States Congress got some bunch of accountants together, and they decided what that land was worth in 1864, decided how much interest that the amount of land, amount of money that would have purchased that land was, and added that to it, and went back to the Lakota and says, we got this money for you to pay you for how we cheated you out of the land in the Treaty of 1864. The Lakota wanted the land back. The United States government said, no, you take the money. And the Lakota wanted at least some of the land back, particularly a lot of the Black Hills. No, you're going to have to take the money or you get nothing. As far as I know, the money is still sitting in an escrow account in some bank someplace, and the Lakota have still not accepted the money. So how do we look at this situation here where, yes, they got a good result in terms of the outcome of the of the Supreme Court decision, but they still have not got any restitution on the situation unless they're willing to accept this money.
Thanks for bringing that up, sir. Just a bit of disclosure. The name Lightfoot is not actually an Ojibwe name, it's a Dakota name, which is strange because I don't identify as a Dakota, which is a different dialect of Lakota. But my great-grandfather was actually a Dakota man named Peter Lightfoot. And that part of my family comes from Crow Creek, South Dakota, which is right on the Missouri River. So it's just about 150 miles upriver from a place you may have heard of called Standing Rock Reservation. And it's maybe a couple hundred miles, few hours drive from the Black Hills of South Dakota. So there is this part of my family that is deeply connected to these issues. I don't identify as a Dakota, mostly because they don't claim me. I'm not a member of the Lakota or Dakota Nation because I have only one relative, a couple generations back, that's Dakota. But I am identified and claimed by the Ojibwe people. But I'm related to several different peoples in the regions just by our shared history and so on. And please forgive me, sir, the Fort Laramie Treaty was 1868, not 64, so it was just after the Civil War had ended, and it was a rewriting of a previous treaty in the 1850s. And the Black Hills are at issue, they remain at issue. The Great Sioux Nation, which was established under the Fort Laramie Treaty, was invaded, conquered, so to speak, by the U.S. military after the Civil War. There was gold found there, so they brought in the military to protect the gold fields and the prospectors then. And terrible things were happening to the Lakota people at the time, primarily involving influenza, smallpox, and the like. So there was a very large shift in power politics following the American Civil War and an increase in white presence in the area. And just over the course of bad practice, the U.S. came to hold the territory instead of the Sioux Nation. Yes, the tribes there refuse to accept the money. They want a negotiation about ownership of the land. At best, they would consider, from what I understand, some sort of co-management or co-ownership arrangement, which is entirely feasible, and other countries have done it. New Zealand is doing it routinely. There's nothing incredibly radical about that. They refuse to accept the money because that would be a waiver of their inherent treaty rights. I should mention that in his most recent visit to and report on the United States, the UN Special Rapporteur James Anaya, who was the previous Special Rapporteur to Vicky Talley-Corpus, specifically mentioned this issue in his report on the United States, and his recommendation was a renegotiation of the situation to return the land to the Sioux people. So that's where we're at right now. I think bringing it back to the table and renegotiating something along the lines of what's been done in New Zealand with a trusteeship or in New Zealand, they did it by giving legal personhood to certain territories and then establishing a guardianship or trusteeship situation over the land that has both indigenous and non-indigenous members of the trustee board in different proportions depending on the negotiation is, again, not entirely unthinkable and radical and entirely pragmatic. So I think it should be put on the table.